It's a great pleasure for me to deliver this talk on Enlightenment, German Orientalism, and the Counter-Enlightenment, and I thank the organizers for giving me this opportunity to share my thoughts. In the aftermath of the murder of George Floyd, there have been controversial discussions around what to do with the legacy of European Enlightenment and his most famous proponent, namely Immanuel Kant. Kant is considered both the father of modern scientific racism as well as a staunch anti-colonial thinker. In response to the question, what difference does difference make? On the one hand, Kant claims that difference makes no difference and promulgates universal values of equality and freedom. Kant's defendants point out that in his later writings, he promoted the idea of cosmopolitan right, Weltbürgerrecht, and the universal ethics of hospitality, criticizing European colonialism as dehumanizing not only for the colonized, but also for the European colonizers. On the other hand, in response to the question, what difference does difference make? Kant understands differences in terms of deficiency, whereby women, Black people, Romas and Sintis, indigenous are considered lacking reason and autonomy and are thus inferior and unfree. Kant, for instance, claims that Romas and Sintis who migrated from India to Europe, despite 300 years of being in Europe, have not improved or progressed, thereby perpetuating the principle of biology is destiny. Interestingly, Kant himself never left Königsberg, but recycled stereotypes about indigenous people and their culture in the colonies based on the narratives of colonial administrators and traders he encountered and read. Critics highlight how Kant perpetuated racist and sexist stereotypes without any knowledge of non-Western epistemologies, languages, and practices. This reminds one of James Mill, who wrote the history of British India. Mill, who had never been to India, did not speak any of the Indian languages, argued that unlike the Indologists who had gone native, he was particularly qualified to write the history of British India precisely because he had no knowledge of India, and that's why he was objective and impartial. Critics also point out that the Kantian principle of the public use of reason, whereby Kantians like Habermas give examples of coffee houses and reading societies as public spheres, as a site which functioned as the birthplace of European Enlightenment, where reason flourished, and how the romanticization of Enlightenment being born in the coffee houses, in the reading society, in reading societies completely ignores the material context in which European Enlightenment emerged. So in response to this kind of, complete erasure of the material conditions where the birth of emancipatory and progressive ideas of equality, freedom, solidarity, cosmopolitanism were promulgated, my question would be, where did the coffee come from? If coffee houses were the birthplace of European Enlightenment, where did the coffee, where did the tea, where did the sugar come from? Who financed the Enlightenment? And here, Fanon's words come to mind, Europe is literally a product of the Third World. Instead of being emancipatory and progressive, critics of the Enlightenment foreground the genocidal terror of reason. And here I particularly have in mind Adorno and Horkheimer's Dialectics of Enlightenment. In this book, they outline the self-barbarization of Europe and analyze the relationship between Enlightenment and fascism, which is why Adorno also talks about a disenchanted aesthetics. How could a country like Germany, which gave us Goethe and Schiller and Bach, also give us Hitler and Goebbels? So the critique of instrumental reason as a form of domination of nature and of man is deeply, deeply linked to European Enlightenment, and this critique also influenced post-structuralism and post-colonial studies. So in the first part of my talk, I focused on the relationship between Enlightenment and colonialism. In the second half now, I'm going to move to the relationship between counter-enlightenment, empire, and also anti-colonialism. Now, this critique of the terror of reason, of course, has a long tradition, and scholars of the counter-enlightenment already rejected many of the central doctrines of the Enlightenment, namely universality, objectivity, rationality, and the claim that enlightenment and reason can provide permanent solutions to all genuine problems of life and thought through adequate powers of observation and logical thinking. Counter-enlightenment thinkers of Romanticism challenged the notion of timeless universal truths and steady linear progress. They insisted on the impotence of reason, arguing that rationalism and scienticism, positivism, distorts reality instead of revealing it. Unlike Kant, Herder, who is considered to be one of the most important thinkers of German Romanticism, celebrated differences, rejecting the primacy of reason. To quote Herder, "I'm not here to think, but to be, feel, live." Counter-Enlightenment thinkers argued that scientific dissection led to cold political dehumanization. Rationalists may know a lot, but understand very little. Counter-Enlightenment scholars, poets, writers argued that originality, creative acts, and illuminating insights are obtained by breaking the rules and not by obeying them. Newton and Locke were denounced as the great enemies for seeking to imprison the free human spirit in constricting intellectual machines. Newtonian physics was accused of crushing the life out of the free, spontaneous, untrammeled human spirit. The Enlightenment doctrine that we can discover what men truly want, globally, universally, and that one can provide technical means and rules of conduct for their greatest permanent satisfaction, and this is what leads to wisdom, virtue, happiness, was found to be unconvincing. Values are not discovered, but are created. They are realized. However, just like the Enlightenment, Counter-Enlightenment was also haunted by Orientalism and the dynamics of othering. So now this brings me to the third part of my talk on German Orientalism and empire. Edward Said famously claimed that Germany did not have a protracted, sustained national interest in the Orient, and thus no Orientalism of a politically motivated sort. With this, Said disregarded Germany and German scholarship from his study of the power-knowledge nexus that legitimized and sustained the project of European colonial empire. Said writes that German Orientalism was interested in the scholarly study of texts rather than in the exercise of colonial power. I quote him, "Germany has a kind of intellectual authority over the Orient, and yet there was nothing in Germany to correspond to the Anglo-French presence in India, the Levant, North Africa. Rather, German Orientalism was almost exclusively scholarly. It was made the subject of lyrics, fantasies, and even novels, but it was never actual." End of quote. Said seems to exculpate the role of German Orientalism from history of European colonialism. It is indeed true that unlike England, France, or Spain, Germany did not have vast colonies. At the same time, Germany was not indifferent to the so-called Europeanization of the earth. As is well known, German Orientalists filled prominent university positions in a number of European countries where they engaged directly in the work of empire building. In fact, the term Indology, in German Indologie, is often associated with German scholarship. In the Netherlands, the term Indologie was used to designate the study of Indian history and culture in preparation for colonial service in the Dutch East Indies. In Orientalism Reconsidered, which was published in 1985, Edward Said once again rejects the claims of varieties of Orientalism as unconvincing and justifies his position with the claim that German Orientalism should be regarded as subordinate to those of France and England. The Indologist and Sanskritist Sheldon Pollock describes in his essay Deep Orientalism, Notes on Sanskrit and Power Beyond the Raj, the influence of German Indology on the British Empire and the fascination, particularly of German Romantic tradition with Indian languages and philosophy, and finally outlines the consequences of this strange fascination during National Socialism. While England and France were invested in knowledge pertaining to the regions directly under their colonial rule, the link between colonial power and colonial knowledge in the German case was much more complex. In When Was the Post-Colonial Thinking at the Limit?, Stuart Hall argues that colonization not only refers to the square meters of occupied territory, but rather to a force fields governed by power-knowledge matrix. A distinction between colonization as a system of imperial conquest and capitalist exploitation versus a system of epistemic violence, a colonization of the mind, is far from straightforward. Thus, even as Thailand and Iran were never European colonies, they were far from untouched by Orientalism and colonialism. Accordingly, the prominence and dynamic nature of German Orientalist scholarship, their fascination surrounding Oriental wisdom, interestingly unfolded in the context of the rise of the Romantic movement. The search for an Ursprache, a Proto-Indo-European language, aspired to ultimately link all great civilizations at a unified cradle or source. The quest was not only for universally valid absolute knowledge, but also one with a universally comprehensive source. As we know, Hegel wished to put together all available human knowledge and synthesize it into one resource. Hegel rejected Kant's denial of the possibility of absolute knowledge, which made Kant a miserable epistemologist in Hegel's view. In his search for universally valid absolute knowledge, Hegel engaged with Indian philosophy. At the same time, Hegel wanted to disprove his intellectual rivals, the German Romantics, who were great champions of Indian wisdom. So on the one hand, Hegel spent a number of years, I think over 10 years, engaging with Indian philosophy, painstakingly reading Indian texts in translation, and at the same time, he kept rejecting Indian thought with contempt and just dismissing it as not qualifying Indian thought as serious philosophy. And yet, Hegel grudgingly was impressed and at the same time was threatened by what he read in the Indian texts. And one wonders whether Hegel was frustrated by many of the cutting edge, perhaps Hegel was frustrated that many of his cutting edge and groundbreaking insights had already been articulated by distant Indian philosophers many centuries before him. So now that I've outlined the very complex relationship between Enlightenment, counter-enlightenment, German Romanticism, and empire, this brings us to the very difficult question of what is to be done. Yeah, how do we decolonize Europe? How do we decolonize the legacies of European thought? Now, one response to this question, what is to be done, is given by the decolonial approach. So, Latin American scholars like Walter Mignolo, Ramon Grossfugel propose that European Enlightenment, European thought, modernity and its legacies are so deeply contaminated, that they are so deeply flawed that one has to reject them, that they speak about epistemic disobedience, they speak about epistemic delinking, and say that we need to return to non-Western cosmologies, ethical principles, and aesthetic practices. In fact, the decolonial approach goes one step forward and criticizes post-colonial studies as Eurocentric and itself in need of decolonization because of its over-reliance on European Enlightenment and Marxism, and post-structuralism. So this is one response to the question of decolonization. Another response to the question of decolonization comes from the critics of post-colonial studies who argue that by rejecting European thought and its legacies of human rights, secularism, cosmopolitanism, constitutionalism, there is the danger of cultural relativism, nihilism, of that anti-enlightenment brings with it authoritarian, despotic impulses. Now, I find both these positions extremely problematic, and in the concluding last 10 minutes, I would like to turn to Gayatri Spivak and the unexpected lessons that the post-colonial feminist Gayatri Spivak teaches us in her text, Can the Subaltern Speak?, in which she warns us against any kind of romanticization of third world agency, of post-colonial subjects as revolutionary agents of history and repositories of a utopian kind of a resistant imaginary. In an extremely counterintuitive move, Spivak highlights the conundrums for a post-colonial queer feminist politics of decolonization and resistance. Now, although compelling in their arguments, in my reading, one of the biggest pitfalls of the decolonial option is the idealization and sentimentalization of non-European subjectivities, epistemologies, and societies. Any discussion regarding colonial forms of economic, political, social, and epistemic violence, so when we are focusing on violence of colonialism, when we are talking about the legacies of European Enlightenment, German Romanticism, counter-enlightenment, and the coercion that came with it, we must at the same time also address the coercive and insidious aspects of pre-colonial native power and societies. So romanticization of non-European communities, of non-European aesthetic, epistemic, and ethical practices is inextricably linked to a relativization of pre-colonial forms of violence in the realm of sexuality, labor, language, religion, caste, age, or gender. Now, this raises the fundamental question of how a critique of colonial and patriarchal violence and domination can lead to emancipation. The figuration, this romanticization of resistant subject positions betrays nostalgic longings for imaginaries of innocent past and an infatuation with an uncontaminated agency that disavows that these are inflected by historical legacies of the Enlightenment. Now, in my view, it is imperative to complicate the relationship between otherness and revolution. There is no outside from where to redeem or renounce the Enlightenment. And this is where my approach very strongly differs from a decolonial approach. Any strategies, tactics, imaginaries, desires, practices, or epistemologies mobilized for emancipatory aims are somehow in a very complex manner linked to the legacies of Europe, which simply cannot be radically rejected. An option that is claimed by the decolonial approach remains unconvincing, for we cannot step outside of history and into untouched past to retrieve uncontaminated pure knowledge, agency, or non-coercive political practice which could theoretically absolve us of complicity in structures of power and violence. As tempting and as alluring as it seems, it disregards the risks and dangers of a categorical rejection of European Enlightenment and its legacies. Now, contrary to both a Habermasian understanding of modernity as an incomplete project and the decolonial rejection of Western modernity, Spivak interprets it in terms of its ambivalence. Now, instead of understanding modernity as an ideal to be mimicked, the decolonial turn views it as a problem that can be simply solved by purging European modernity from the decolonized world. So one solution for decolonization is that we just simply reject everything European. Now, Spivak problematizes decolonial options nostalgia for an idealized past, as well as any claims that recognition of non-European indigenous perspectives is automatically a recipe for decolonization of the mind. Rather, Spivak's effort is to shift the geography of reason through an attitudinal change vis-a-vis ideas like political agency, cosmopolitanism, equality, freedom, emancipation. Spivak explains that subalternity is produced when the disenfranchised are exiled from access to critical thinking by denying them access to the master's tools. So this is a very interesting kind of experiment that Spivak does with Audre Lorde's claim that you can't use the master's tools to dismantle the master's house. So Spivak would say, for example, when we engage with the German Romantic tradition, of course it's flawed, of course it's contaminated, of course it leaves us with violent legacies, but this legacy is both. She uses the metaphor of pharmacon. So it's both, it's poison, but it can also be medicine. It can also be counter poison. And this idea actually resonates with Fanon, who already in his essay, A Dying Colonialism, remarks, and I quote him, expressing oneself in French, understanding French is no longer tantamount to treason or to an impoverishing identification with the occupier. Used by the voice of the combatants, conveying in a positive way the message of the revolution, the French language also becomes an instrument of liberation. End of quote. So here Fanon is already talking about the very, very ambivalent relationship the post-colonial world or the anti-colonial world has to the master's tools. So instead of celebrating or romanticizing subaltern agency, Spivak, following the communist thinker Antonio Gramsci, understands decolonization as the process of undoing the conditions that place the subaltern in a submissive position vis-a-vis hegemonic groups. Gramsci emphasizes the significance of a consciousness of one's own worth. Only when there is a sense of self-worth is desubalternization possible. Spivak follows this Gramscian idea and argues that subalterns are not people who are deprived of power, and they are certainly not people who are revolutionary resistant subjects, but she talks about subalternity, particularly in her later works, as those who are robbed of the means to imagine themselves as subjects who have agency. So decolonization is not about romanticizing resistance, but, according to Spivak, training the imagination of those who have been denied access to intellectual and aesthetic labor. So, according to Spivak, when we are talking about revolution, when we are talking about decolonization, when we are talking about resistance, we need to supplement empowerment training. We need to supplement ideas of revolution and resistance with aesthetic agency. We should not forget that sapientia, namely wisdom, has its root in sapor, namely taste, faculty of feeling, intuition, sensibility. The imagination mediates between what we have inherited, our habits of thinking, and the possibility of critical thinking, of thinking differently, of thinking otherwise. I would like to end my talk by recalling one of the most important disagreements between two of the most powerful Black intellectuals, namely W.E.B. Du Bois and Booker T. Washington, following the American Civil War and the end of slavery, which also inspires Spivak's thinking about aesthetic education. Now, the conflict between Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois was about what form of education is best suited for recently liberated collectivities. Booker T. Washington believed that the key to emancipation of African Americans was through education in vocational and industrial training, which would allow them to be financially independent by earning a living wage as plumbers, electricians, carpenters, mechanics, builders. In Washington's view, previously uneducated groups must quickly acquire literacy and numeracy to become equal members of society through economic empowerment. W.E.B. Du Bois, on the other hand, argued that emancipation entailed much more than becoming employable as a skilled laborer. So he said, of course, economic empowerment, I mean, he was a Marxist. So of course, he said wage labor is extremely important, particularly for newly liberated slaves. And yet the 40 acres and a mule that was promised to newly freed African Americans in the aftermath of the Civil War as compensation for unpaid labor during slavery was insufficient to guarantee dignity. Du Bois claimed that freed slaves needed to train their imagination, and that it was not enough to have freedom from until one understood what freedom is for. Washington accused Du Bois of thinking like a white man when promoting arts and humanities, which he considered. So Washington said that for Black people, for African Americans, these were luxuries beyond the means of the poor and disenfranchised. Du Bois, on the other hand, championed training the mind for abstract thinking, especially for vulnerable groups, as key to human emancipation and full citizenship for persons who had previously been denied this right. And this is exactly what Spivak takes up when she talks about decolonization as being a complex process, being a critical process of understanding what an ambivalent relationship the post-colonial world has to Europe and its legacies. So I'm going to make last 2 points and then conclude my speech. So Spivak uses the metaphor when she's describing the relationship of the post-colonial world to Europe and its legacies. Spivak uses the metaphor of the child of a rape. And she talks about how the post-colonial world has to develop a critical intimacy with the legacies of Europe, with ideas of equality, freedom, cosmopolitanism, secularism, constitutionalism, human rights, democracy, which are all legacies of European Enlightenment, of counter-enlightenment, of German Romanticism. And Spivak talks about how the challenge for the post-colonial world is to learn to love the child of a rape. And here particularly, when she's talking about critical intelligence, she says, in order to train the imagination, in order to nurture and foster critical intelligence, the aesthetics plays an extremely important role. And I'm going to conclude by quoting Spivak, who speaks about the aesthetics. She talks about an aesthetic education, she talks about aesthetic agency, and also aesthetic enlightenment, that the aesthetics is the slow cooking of the soul, which can sometimes reward us with unexpected lessons. Thank you so much for your attention. I look forward to the discussion and thank you for your